Welcome back to the HiKeiLoKei YouTube channel, where I didn't change my hairstyle and you can't prove that I did. Avatar: The Last Airbender is without a doubt one of the best animated TV shows to come out in the 2000s. I would go so far as to say it's one of the best animated TV shows to ever come out and one of the best TV shows to ever be written. The show was critically acclaimed, masterfully written, beautifully animated, and wonderfully told. So what the f happened here? In 2007, Avatar: The Last Airbender was entering its final season and hype was through the roof. So Nickelodeon and Paramount Productions decided now was a better time than ever to start profiting off of their most valuable asset. And it was announced that they would be bringing on M. Night Shyamalan to write, direct, and produce a trilogy of movies based on the hit TV series. Sorry if I pronounced his last name wrong, but don't worry, I'm going to do my best to not say it again through the rest of the video. Everyone was ecstatic to have the project going, especially the series creators Michael DiMartino and Brian Konietzko, but the production of these movies ended up going a lot worse than either of them could have possibly expected. Reportedly, M. Night wasn't as open to criticism and advice on the making of the adaptation as he stated he would be. It eventually got so bad that supposedly Michael and Brian both tried to shut down the production of this movie on separate occasions because they never wanted to see it finished.
I assume you guys had nothing to do with the movie.
We had nothing to do.
Well, I mean, we were dragged through. It's a long, horrible story. There's no short version of the story. That was our stance from the get-go.
Sure.
A, we didn't want it to be done at all before anyone was attached. We didn't want. And then B, if it was going to be done, we wanted to do it, but they weren't going to let us. C, when they attached Night, we just thought, well, this is what we've been dealt. We'll offer help when it's asked of us. And if it's not, we'll stay out of the way. And in the beginning, it was more positive, and we offered help. But then, we had a big falling out, and the only thing that can be said, it was a wasted opportunity.
M. Night supposedly wanted to make the movie more adult than the TV series, as he found it too slapsticky. He wanted to make characters like Sokka a lot more grounded. He does this by changing his name to Sokka and removing all of his character development, but we'll get into that later. The movie went on to spend 3 years in development and cost $150 million to produce and reportedly another $130 million to market. Speaking of marketing, the worst part of this movie was the fact that there was an ad campaign where they told kids, oh, you can bend any element as long as you try hard enough. F you. I tried airbendings for weeks until this movie came out and I never got it. You lying pieces of shit. I looked like a fool and it was all your fucking fault. But after marketing and production, M. Night had gone $30 million over the $250 million budget that Paramount Pictures gave him to produce all 3 films. We were supposed to get 3 movies, one covering each book. So when people wonder why this movie never got a sequel, it wasn't purely because it was ass, it was also because of some of the most financially irresponsible production choices a single man could ever make. The movie went on to barely make a profit, pulling in $319 million in the box office after being released in theaters on July 1st, 2010. But alongside a less than impressive box office performance, it also pulled in scores so low that it couldn't even graduate high school if it tried. Both fans and newcomers to the Avatar series were reasonably upset about how this film turned out. But what I want to do here today is finally watch this movie and figure out what the fuck M. Night was cooking. Maybe this movie is actually a hidden gem and we're all too blind to see it. Or the more likely answer, the movie is dog shit and I'm about to waste 2 hours of my life watching it to figure out why this movie is dog shit. The movie has a similar intro to that of the TV show, which I respect. The monologue doesn't kick in until after the show of elemental power, which feels weird. However, I think we can learn a lot about the problems of this movie just from the opening sequence. The lighting is just not good in this scene. Like, I see the effect they're going for, and they're not getting it, and the editing is just bad. Like, why do fire, water, and air end with the transition from their elements hitting the screen, but for Earth, the dude just stands there, stanced up? And you can still make a good amount of definition out of these people and their body and their clothes, so it just feels like they forgot to turn the lights on. Then after all of that, instead of giving the audience some expected eye candy or visual spectacle, we get the lore explained to us by the form of literal scrolling text. I hate when movies do this. You could hand me a damn pamphlet when I walked in the movie theater and I'd still be just as pissed. Either way, I personally don't like it because it feels like you're putting too much work on the audience. This is probably the most egregious case of show don't tell we've experienced on the channel thus far. There are times when it works, like in the movie Blade Runner 2049, but we let that slide because that movie was good and required media literacy to fucking understand. That and the movie was also a spin-off sequel hybrid of a movie that came out in 1992, so a refresher course makes sense. Another reason it doesn't work here is because the movie will literally be shoving it down our throats for the next hour and 43 minutes. All of the information that gets explained to us is explained to you by every single character in the movie every time they get the chance. There's also a little title card opening thing here, and I might be jumping the gun, but I think it's safe to say we're not getting a book 2 anytime soon. This is our first character, an excuse for Katara, and her brother, that might just be Sokka, played by Nicola Peltz and Jackson Rathbone respectively. Now, if you've watched the TV shows, you might notice that there's something a little different going on here in the skin tone department. That's right, Nicola Peltz and Jackson Rathbone are both white, while their TV show counterparts are both heavily coded as East Asian. Although it's still a problem today, it was a really big problem when this movie came out. People began protesting this movie and coining the term race bending. It's really nice to know that humor pretty much hasn't evolved in the last 13 years, because if this movie came out today, that is the exact same term that we would have come up with. We'll come back to this later, but these two characters aren't the only ones to have their race changed, so keep that in mind and try not to get jump scared when brown Zuko shows up. The movie opens up in practically the same way that the TV show does, with Sokka and Katara hunting for food for their tribe. But this time, their effort to find Aang is actually something that's conscious. The thing is, when they do this in the TV show, it's one of the strongest character moments in TV history. In the show, this scene is used to show how powerful yet uncontrolled Katara is. And it shows how arrogant Sokka is, but how intelligent he is when it comes to things like hunting, fishing, and general survivability. But more importantly, if you remember the dialogue in this scene, it begins a long arc of him learning how to accept women as his equals and give everyone a fair shake. But they can't do that here because instead they want to focus on moving the story forward. Character development is just a side quest. So instead of making you care about the protagonists and displaying their powers and attributes, they just show you that Katara and Sokka are really good at hitting things with blunt objects. Katara and Sokka head down into the iceberg where they find Aang, played by Noah Ringer. This is another example of them swapping races, but if I'm being brutally honest with you, you could have told me Aang was white in the TV show and I would have believed you. He's more likely than not Tibetan, which would make him Asian, but to me in the TV show he looks like a regular ass white kid. So I'll just let this one off with a warning. Another large reason that this scene doesn't work just from a storytelling standpoint is that this movie's been going on for about 10 minutes now, and I couldn't tell you anything about any of our main characters. As opposed to the TV show, where the scene goes out of its way to show you the personality of all the main characters without really ever telling you anything about them. This scene shows that Aang, even after being frozen for who knows how long, is still a happy-go-lucky and energetic kid. Sokka's initial reaction is to not touch him and leave him there in the cold, while Katara's reaction is to get to know him more, take care of him, and to be his friend. The very first thing that Aang does in the TV show is ask to go penguin sledding, and the reactions of Sokka and Katara tell us everything we need to know about these three for the time being. But as of right now, the only thing we know about these characters at the moment is that Sokka is kinda grouchy and everyone is white. In the next scene, Katara goes to talk to Aang, where he immediately says that he needs to get home. Firstly, I do actually like the way the tattoos look in this movie. Personally, I think they look really good. As easy as it would have been to give him thick blue lines, I appreciate them going their route of making the design look more interesting, because if we're being realistic, his original tattoos probably would have gotten grating to look at over long periods of time. But the fact that Aang's first instinct is that he wants to go home? Why? Something that we don't learn until later in the TV show is that Aang ran away from home because he was scared of being the Avatar, and it's the same reason he tries to go penguin sledding, to distract himself from that fact. He deliberately delayed his return from the Southern Water Tribe as long as he possibly could, just because he was anxious about what was waiting for him back at home. Even if the context of the story that the movie is going for doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm sure they planned out what they would have done in future movies, but they're really missing the points of how avoidant and naive Aang was in Book 1 of Avatar. This decision directly contracts the storyline that they give him in this movie, so I don't know what they were cooking with this line. If I had to take a guess, they just need a dialogue to pass the time before the Fire Nation attacks, which should be about now. Yeah, the pacing of this movie is pretty scuffed. I get that they have a whole TV season to put into a movie, but you could always just not do that. Legitimately, this is a problem that you created. I just reviewed a movie that had 5 movies in its series. Realistically, if you wanted to tell the story in an interesting way, you need at least 6 movies with 2 for each book. I mean, can you think about how hard it would have gone if we got the Blue Spirit as a cliffhanger ending for this movie? My point is that Paramount kind of set themselves up for failure when they tried to condense 60 episodes of media into 3 movies. Our next character is a sorry substitute for Prince Zuko, played by Dev Patel. There is something that you might be noticing is wildly different about him. That's right, he doesn't have his ponytail. Zuko's top knot is a huge part of his character, and the fact that he doesn't have one is nothing short of f***ing shameful. The top knot in the Fire Kingdom is often worn as a sign of power, pride, and honor. When he cuts his hair at the beginning of season 2, that moment signifies the true beginning of his struggle with finding peace in his life. And I understand that they may have avoided giving him the top knot because the actor for him is Indian, and the top knot as a hairstyle is typically more traditional Japanese, but I do have one itty bitty tiny way to fix that. Cast a Japanese person, you dingbat! I don't understand the fucking vendetta that they have with casting the main characters in the movie. Your two East Asian main characters are now white, and your main Japanese character is now East Asian. You didn't need to add anything new or different to this part of the movie. The nations in The Last Airbender are something that are very well developed and took a lot of reference from real-world countries and cultures. So it becomes especially ridiculous when you remember that the Fire Nation is based heavily on Meiji-era Japan, as well as other West Asian cultures, but for the most part, it's Japan. A huge part of this especially is the heavy emphasis on honor or pride that was actually very prevalent back then, and I believe it's still prevalent in some West Asian cultures today. Zuko's burn mark is also just not interesting. Like, it's there, but honestly, if I wasn't looking for it, I'd probably miss it. In fact, the top comment on the trailer for the movie is someone saying that he doesn't have his scar, even though he does, it's just barely there. I get that they're trying to make a more realistic burn mark, but you have to remember that Zuko got the burn mark because someone who can control fire with his body burned his face. Do you see the problem here? Realism can only take you so far before it hits a brick wall. They should have made it more interesting to look at, because with how long this video is, you'll probably forget that it's even there. It pisses me off so bad you have no clue. This is not Zuko. This is some random guy who burned himself while playing with a sparkler. Aang is quickly apprehended and taken to Zuko. Zuko questions Aang, but Aang essentially says 12 and refuses to answer any of their questions, and he's taken onto the Fire Nation ship. Katara and Sokka discuss what to do next, and the only reason that Katara wants to go after Aang is because he found him and he's our responsibility. No, you 180-degree Allen wrench, he's not your problem. He came out of the iceberg and his ass would have stayed there if you hadn't woken him up. In the show, and get used to hearing that by the way, Katara and Sokka agree to help Aang, granted their reasons are different, but considerably more interesting and nuanced. At this time in the show, Katara is already aware that Aang is the Avatar, and she goes to save him because she knows the world needs the Avatar. Sokka wishes to stay and protect the village, but it's stated in the TV show that the Water Tribe has no defenses as all of their men were captured by the Fire Nation. He only ends up going because he wants to protect his sister, and he secretly knows it's the right thing to do, but mostly the first thing. But back to the movie, Sokka agrees to help Katara, and then they find Appa, who actually made the transition to 3D CGI a lot more convincingly than I was expecting. Don't get used to Appa, by the way. He's pretty much not relevant in this movie. Back on the boat, we're introduced to Uncle Iroh. Actually, I'm sorry. For some reason, it's pronounced Uncle Iroh. Weird pronunciations are a constant in this movie, so if you choose to watch it when I'm done here, get ready for that. Aang calls himself the Avatar, and Katara calls Aang Ong, but Sokka calls him Ung. Are we even talking about the same dude anymore? But the name pronunciation that probably pisses me off more than anything is that Sokka's name is pronounced Sokka. What? Why? This is one of those things that they change in this movie just to change things for no reason. But back to the story, believe it or not, Iroh is one of the best adapted characters in the whole movie. But keep in mind, the bar is on the floor. He's kind to Aang, much like in the TV show, but he's really only there to keep Zuko's dumbass in check. Before Katara and Sokka depart, we're finally introduced to the grandmother of Sokka and Katara. In the show, her name is Gran, and she's actually interesting, but that's not the case here. But I doubt you needed me to tell you that. Gran tells Sokka and Katara that she believes Aang was the Avatar that disappeared 100 years ago. She also drops a ton of facts about the spirits. Spirits are something that don't really get explored until about 7 episodes into the TV show, but for some reason they spoon feed it to us 14 minutes into the movie. This information doesn't even end up being relevant for Katara and Sokka. The information that she spouts here is just to give more exposition to the audience in the least natural way possible. I do like that the grandmother is a character at all in this movie, but in the show, she served to be a lot more of a motivation factor for Sokka and mainly Katara. But here, she kind of just exists to dump even more exposition onto the characters and audience. I understand that this is a movie, and realistically, they can't do it all. But one of the most important things to get right in a movie is its opening. You need to make me care about these characters before bad things happen to them. I don't care that Aang got abducted. He's had 3 lines and none of them make me like him more than when he came out of the iceberg. This movie seems to be operating on the belief that having an antagonist is enough to make me care about the protagonist to any degree. Also, no, I did not change hats because I forgot I had school and left in a hurry. Thank you for asking. Back on the boat, Iroh begins testing Aang to see if he truly is the Avatar. Iroh assumes that he would fail, so he neglected to tell him the part where if he fails the test, he has to go to the Fire Nation. Aang actually passed the test, which once again, slightly annoys me. I understand that they wouldn't have time to train him in all the elements in movie form, but I think it's starting to show a fundamental misunderstanding of not only the character they're writing, but also the world that they're inhabiting. I may be misinterpreting this, I'm having a hard time understanding exactly what this test is, but supposedly he actually can't bend these elements, they like to be around him. I don't know, that just kind of sounds like bending elements to me. But also this test makes no sense. This is a big example of overcomplicating something that should be so easy. In the show, they just look at his forehead and think, oh, that's the Airbender. We killed all of them, so process of elimination, that's the Avatar. But here, for some reason, they have to pull out a random assortment of that gravitates toward Aang or something. And if he really is bending all those elements, that causes even more of a confusing conundrum. Aang starts out with a rudimentary understanding of water bending and lacks the ability to fire or earthbend entirely. Here he seems to do both without even trying. Earthbending is an element that's supposed to be naturally hard for Aang as it's the antithesis of airbending. And here it seems like he can earthbend without lifting a finger. He also has a whole arc about refusing to learn how to firebend, and Aang's requirement to learn firebending is the only reason that Zuko joins the gang. After Aang realizes that they intend to capture him, we get our first real display of what Aang is capable of. I don't hate the way that airbending looks in this movie, but I do still think it looks a little underwhelming, confusing, and kinda stupid, so it's pretty in line with the rest of the film. M. Night is nothing if not consistent. What's even more underwhelming is the end of the scene where Aang just flies off. There was a huge battle here in the end of the second episode of the show. It was something our characters had to prepare for. It was our first preview of the Avatar state, and it showed some of Katara and Zuko's battle prowess, though Katara's was not great. But here, Katara, Sokka, and Zuko didn't really do anything. They didn't even learn how to fly Appa. Sokka and Katara just show up, not helping Aang at all, and then they leave for the Southern Air Temple. Props where props is due though, the Southern Air Temple looks pretty good, but considering it's entirely made of 3D models, it'd be more impressive if they f***ed it up somehow. This scene is pretty much ripped straight from the TV show, where Aang realizes that all the monks and the air nomads had been wiped out by all the firebenders years ago. It's pretty hardcore that they actually decided to go the route of leaving skeletons on the ground everywhere. He even finds the remains of Monk Gyatso's body on the ground. In this flashback, we also learn that Monk Gyatso is black. Although this is a great example of race bending, I'm not sure I care that he's black. But why is he bigger and middle-aged? You took a skinny old Tibetan man and you made him heavy-set, middle-aged, and black. And it kind of goes against the design of the universe, does it not? The monks are experienced airbenders, experience that comes with age. And it's pretty obvious that physical fitness and form were something that the air nomads constantly kept in mind. And the fact that they're old is actually integral to their character. So it's pretty weird to me that this guy's like 10 years younger than my dad. This is the first scene in the movie where Aang enters the Avatar state, and he travels to the spirit realm for the first time here as well. He gets brought back out from the spirit realm by Katara in the TV show, as an example of the bond they've formed. But since these two haven't actually shared any character development, he's brought back by what appears to be Roku's dragon. The next scene is also pretty much ripped straight from the TV show, where we meet Admiral Zhao, played by Asif Manvi. This scene was used to set up a threat and an ongoing challenge for Zuko, but here it's used to set up the fact that Zuko has been banished from the Fire Nation and is an enemy of the Fire Nation, quote unquote. I'm actually fine with that change. It's like one of the only good things they decided to do in writing. Like, they kind of just condensed that a bit. The scene is pretty much just Admiral Zhao flexing on Zuko and taking every small chance he can to be petty, which admittedly is pretty funny. This guy invited Zuko into his own home to make fun of him. That is some alpha male behavior. I don't think it's wrong to say this, but I don't know if it was a good idea to cast the entire Fire Nation as Indian when all of the characters' names are either inspired by Chinese or Japanese. Nobody's going to assume you're racist because you look at this guy and don't immediately see Prince Zuko. I mean, this nigga definitely ain't Admiral Zhao. Same deal with Katara and Sokka, but I think the dichotomy is a lot more obvious here than anywhere else. If Toph was in this movie, I bet you $20 they'd cast her as a Hispanic chick. I'm not even joking. Now here comes a scene that made me fucking hate this movie, and it's probably like 90% of the reason I decided to write this video in the first place. While traveling through the Southern Earth Kingdom, the gang is abducted by Fire Nation generals who have taken over a nearby town. This means they skipped over episodes 4 and 5, which should have introduced the Kyoshi Warriors and King Boomy, but who the cares about that? This kid is supposed to be Haru, but his character is made much less interesting. So much less interesting that he has 2 lines and his name is never once mentioned. After arriving in the town, Aang starts an uprising of Earthbenders and everyone begins to fight back against the Fire Nation. This scene really annoys me because it was the first major part of character development Katara was supposed to get, and she just doesn't have it anymore. This is where we were supposed to learn that Katara is bold and caring and wants to help inspire change, but here she's just... girl. This scene also has one of the worst things I've ever laid my eyes on. It shows how weak bending is for anybody who is not a complete and total master of it. This scene features these incredibly long panning shots for no reason. It takes 7, yes, 7 people to move 1 rock. During the time that it took them to do this, a Fire Nation soldier could have just thrown a rock at them. Or hell, you could just punch them in the face while they're focused on that. But because fire is weak to rock, the Fire Nation soldiers get scared and run away, so that's the end of that. The reason they were able to fend off the Fire Nation soldiers is because in this universe, firebenders cannot generate their own fire. They have to have a pre-existing source of fire, which makes bending pretty much obsolete in most settings. So get used to these things conveniently lying around anywhere anyone needs to firebend. After everyone celebrates their victory, an old man tells the gang that the Fire Nation took all the scrolls related to bending. But then they find this water bending scroll anyway. So I guess they just wrote that into the script to be a little silly. Immediately after this, Aang tells Sokka and Katara that he doesn't know how to bend the other elements. Which, yeah, might be true, but why does he mention that here? This movie has no sense of pace or character progression. I still couldn't tell you one thing about Sokka or Katara. And Aang is just sad in this universe. He's not the fun-loving idiot we're used to. He's just a kid who has some sick tattoos, hits people with wind, and listens to My Chemical Romance. And this entire scene is shot like 4 inches away from Aang's face for no reason. Like, why are they so close? I need some damn personal space right now. This is probably where the movie takes the biggest diversions from the show, for better or worse. Who are we kidding? It's for worse. Firstly, Aang doesn't divulge this information to Sokka and Katara until episode 12 of the TV show. If I'm not mistaken, the horror episode is episode 6, meaning we mostly just skipped 6 episodes? And at the time, he does this because Aang begins to doubt himself and tells Katara this information because he needs to be consoled and reassured that he can really do this. Here, it's just some throwaway information to explain why the movie needs to skip to episode 17. The plan for the gang is still similar to the TV show at this point. Their goal is still to get to the Northern Water Tribe, but they skip so much important shit in the TV show. So here's all of the episodes they skip the majority or entirety of. The waterbending scroll is skipped entirely. Jet is skipped entirely. The Great Divide is skipped entirely. Thank God. The plot of the storm is skipped entirely, but the thing I just mentioned was from the storm, so it's kinda there. The Fortune Teller is skipped entirely, Bottle of the Water Tribe is skipped entirely, and the Northern Air Temple is skipped entirely, but it'll come up later. So instead of doing all of those side adventures and actually getting character development along them, what they do instead is have a montage of them saving several small cities in an attempt to change the tides of the war against the Fire Nation. You know what? I'll give the movie this. At least black people exist in this universe, but those surely are not Earth Nation outfits. In the next scene, we're introduced to Fire Lord Ozai, played by Cliff Curtis. Once again, I understand that this is a movie, but wow, this reveal is mid. In the TV show, Fire Lord Ozai isn't revealed until the 3rd season of the show. Here we see it at like the 35-minute mark, but I think that this only serves to make the movie more complicated. Fire Lord Ozai didn't actually do anything in season 1. He wasn't a major player. Admiral Zhao was the real threat we had to worry about for season 1. There is no reason to put Fire Lord Ozai in this movie because he doesn't do anything in the movie. Also, this guy looks like a fucking doof. This man looks as threatening as a loosely bolted ceiling fan. Do you remember how in season 3 of the show, how Ozai is so buff it's almost scary? Can you imagine if he like ripped off his shirt and we just saw his dad bod? It's not gonna work. It's just so annoying because we don't need to have Ozai. Admiral Zhao is and was the main threat to both Zuko and the gang, so shoving Ozai in here is pretty stupid. Ozai's silhouette alone became a terrifying threat, but here it just feels like Cliff Curtis cosplaying Lord Ozai. Admiral Zhao goes to tell Ozai that he has begun searching for the ocean and moon spirits. He wishes to kill them so that he can easily conquer the Water Kingdom. He also says that he has spies in the Earth Kingdom that are currently looking for the Avatar. If you thought that the way Aang gave his backstory was ham-fisted, you're gonna hate where Zuko gives his lore. Zuko and Iroh go to a Fire Nation colony for unexplained reasons. It's probably just so Zuko could find the new place to brood, because brooding is all he f***ing does in this movie. And when Iroh asks why Zuko doesn't just settle down and have a nice life somewhere like here, Zuko calls over this random f***ing small child and asks if he knows what happened to the prince. Okay, great, so now you're a loser and a creep. The story remains largely the same, but I think we're underestimating how important it was that Iroh was the one to tell the story. I think we often forget that Iroh is Ozai's brother, so the fact that Iroh is the one to tell the story does hold a lot of emphasis. It's also used to explain why Zuko's crew thinks that Zuko is an idiot. Zuko and Iroh have no desire to tell this story, but Iroh tells Zuko's crew this story because he needs them to understand why Zuko is the way he is and why he does what he does. This makes his crew more dedicated to Zuko. Admittedly, they're not important characters, but it gives us some understanding of why they would bother being there at all. Anyway, this random kid tells us the entire backstory of Zuko. I don't really have anything to say about it, but I do f***ing hate the fact that this movie calls the Agni Kai the Agni Key. I don't know if the writers realized this, but Agni Kai actually has a significant meaning to the name. It's derived from the languages of Sanskrit and Japanese. Then again, this movie doesn't seem to care about the fact that the Fire Nation is mostly based off of West Asian cultures, but has mostly East Asian inhabitants. The last Airbender drinking game idea. Every time they butcher the pronunciation of something, take a shot. The next bit of plot is really confusing and mixes together about 3 episodes, including the Blue Spirit, the Northern Air Temple, and the Southern Air Temple. There's probably one I'm missing, but who cares at this point? Aang travels to the Northern Air Temple in an effort to learn how to contact the spirits once again, where instead of meeting Tio and the Mechanist, he meets this random guy who just happens to be here. In the show, this room is actually more represented in the Southern Air Temple. There might be one in the Northern Air Temple, but I don't believe it's ever shown. But I do like that they have a reference to this room at all. This random guy turns out to be an Earth Nation spy, and Aang is abducted by General Zhao's men, beginning the Blue Spirit plotline. But wouldn't you know it, nothing gets you to the spirit realm faster than being suspended by your hands and feet, and Aang enters the spirit realm when he falls asleep. I think it goes without saying, but the spirit realm was grossly mishandled in this movie. Instead of being a link between worlds that Aang learns to understand and control, it's a way for this random dragon nigga to give Aang advice on how to progress the plot. The dragon spirit literally just tells Aang about the Fire Nation's plan to attack the Water Tribe, and then Aang wakes up immediately following that. Why does the dragon know that? As much as it can, the next few minutes of this movie pretty much exactly follow the Blue Spirit episode of the show, except for now the Blue Spirit moves really weird and it has a funny haircut. It would have been so easy to make this mask in real life, but no. Let's give Zuko a weave and make his mask show his lips. Other than the start of the episode, it's pretty much the exact same as the TV show. Zuko breaks out Aang, they fight together in this fight scene, but this time it sucks, and Zuko holds Aang hostage so that they can both leave. They also have the archer that hits the impossible shot, but here it kind of makes no sense because this is just some random guy with really good aim. In the TV show, it's requisite information that the Yuyan archers are extraordinarily skilled, and hitting a shot like this is pretty much impossible for a normal person, but more than doable for them. The Yuyan archers are introduced in this episode, so the fact that they don't address them at all is kind of stupid. This movie also doesn't feature one of the most pivotal interactions in the entire show, where Aang asks Zuko if they could have been friends if they were born at a different time, and Zuko attacks him for it. A moment that is so powerful because it shows the dichotomy between these two characters so well. It also becomes something that Zuko thinks about to himself for a long time after this episode. But what happens here? Aang takes Zuko to the forest, and he leaves. Without saying anything or Zuko even waking up, Aang just leaves. Now here's where things get even more convoluted from the show. I know I thought it wasn't possible either, but I also didn't think Katara would ever be born in New York, And here we are. After returning from the Blue Spirit venture, Admiral Zhao attempts to have Zuko killed because he believes that Zuko is the Blue Spirit. This does happen in the TV show, but this doesn't happen until episode 18, which is 5 episodes and weeks after the Blue Spirit incident. Here it happens the moment Zuko gets back to his ship. But why does Zhao think Zuko did it? Did he see his face? Did he find a necklace he was wearing? Nope. He has no evidence whatsoever. And he even says that. In the show, Admiral Zhao knows it's Zuko because the swords that the Blue Spirit used to fight are the same swords that Zuko has in the cabin on his ship. The fact that Admiral Zhao goes up to Zuko's father and says, "Hey, I think your son is a traitor," is ridiculous. With no evidence. Also, the people who attempt to assassinate Zuko are the pirates that Katara stole the scroll from. But because that episode was reduced to a singular line of dialogue, it doesn't matter. They took a perfectly woven web and destroyed it. And in its place, they wrote,
"I fear that your son is not only incompetent, but also a traitor. Of course, I cannot prove this, sire."
I don't think anything else shines as bright of a light on how incompetent the writing of this movie is more than this singular scene. The next scene skips a lot of episodes. Just since we're getting into the third act here, I want to cover the list of episodes that we've covered more than half of in this movie, either in terms of plot or something important happening. Keep in mind, in the movie, we are now on episode 18 of 20. The list includes The Boy in the Iceberg, The Avatar Returns, The Blue Spirit. That's it. Those are the only episodes that have been truly covered by this movie. The Northern Air Temple, Bottle of the Water Tribe, The Fortune Teller, The Deserter, The Waterbending Scroll, Jet, both Winter Solstice episodes, The Warriors of Kyoshi, The Great Divide, and The King of Omashu have been entirely omitted. I'm going to say this once again and for the last time. I understand this is a movie. I know they can't do anything and everything the show did, but that's not my problem. My problem is that if you don't touch on an episode at all, you leave so much room for character growth on the table. The Kyoshi Warriors is such an important episode for Sokka. The Deserter starts an incredibly important character arc for Aang. The Northern Air Temple might be one of the most important episodes in the series in terms of future repercussions. They leave out so many important details that destroy these characters. Quick, tell me one thing about Katara. You can't. She has done nothing at all. One of the best written characters in all of fiction, and they boil her down to being Aang's sidekick. Aang's female, emotional sidekick. Like, what? She is supposed to be one of the most competent, independent, smart women in all of media, and this is what they do to her. I think another thing that annoys me is the fact that Katara is like, what, 12, 14 in the entire show? This is supposed to be a character that young women can look up to. What do they have now? Like, I hate to sound preachy, but this is genuinely stupid. It's saddening. When I watched the show originally when I was like 10, I didn't even like Katara that much. Now watching this as a 20-year-old, I'm just baffled by what they did here. There's only a little bit left of this movie, so I'm gonna try to get through it without losing my mind. Our characters finally arrive at the North Pole, where they're greeted by... Why does Yue's hair look like a penis? Guys, is it really that hard to find people with brown skin? Not you! I've had the right amount of you. My problem isn't the fact that white people simply exist or are main characters in the world of Avatar. I don't give a shit about that. I've said it before, I've always thought Aang was just a regular white dude. But why do they go out of their way to make all of the background characters the same race? Are there any Inuit people in this movie at all? I think the only time we see any real diversity in the background characters is this one singular montage where they go to a bunch of random villages. The Water Tribe begins preparations for the Fire Nation to attack, and Sokka is designated to protect Yue. Why? These people do not know Sokka. It has not been disclosed that Sokka is a warrior yet, and he has shown no ability to be a warrior. They just met this guy. In the show, he ends up being Yue's bodyguard because Sokka doesn't get along with Han, who is Yue's boyfriend at the time. So Arnook has to assign him elsewhere. But here, my man just assigns Yue to Sokka to get him laid, I guess. World's best wingman. By the way, this isn't even Chief Arnook. He doesn't exist in this movie. This is Master Pakku, who isn't even a sexist. The character of Master Pakku is effectively ruined because they didn't want to take the time to develop Arnook as a character. And furthermore, this means Katara gets less character development by proxy. You know, something else just hit me. It has been months since the beginning of the movie. And it doesn't feel like that because nothing has happened. Nothing has changed. All of our character development, if there's been any, keeps happening off screen. Yue and Sokka are already in love because they've been together for weeks but we only know that because they tell us it directly. Similar to the show, Zuko snuck onto Zhao's ship while Iroh pretends to be his strategist. Zuko does this so that he can go after Aang first while the Fire Nation is attacking the Northern Water Tribe. This scene is also practically ripped from the show where Zuko dives into the water and swims into the city. To get into contact with the spirits, Aang asks for a spiritual place where he can meditate, to which Yue replies, "There is a very spiritual place." Class A writing, guys. Couldn't have done it better myself. This is the first time in the movie Aang has voluntarily entered the spirit realm, so why does he even think this would work? Regardless, Yue and Sokka head back to safety and Katara stays behind to protect Aang. But here's where we get our second scene of bending being actually interesting. Well, interesting might be the wrong word. Katara can't even put up a fight because the movie never taught her how to use her waterbending. Wasn't she debatably a master of waterbending at this point in the show? I swear there's a line in the show where Master Pakku calls her Master Katara. But here, Zuko shows up and she gets folded like a paper airplane. This is coming at her at like 4 miles an hour and she couldn't even prep for it. Dude! Walk to the left! When Aang gets to the spirit realm, Roku first tells him that he needs to take responsibility for what he did to his people. Okay, not the time. He also tells him to take the time to grieve and accept the loss. Okay, what are you, the spirit of counseling? He asked you how to defeat the Fire Nation, not how to deal with his depression and anxiety, but in the end, Roku tells him to use the ocean to defeat the Fire Nation. Oh boy, use water to defeat fire. Yeah, I know how to play Pokemon, you f***ing goon. What is Aang supposed to do against the giant f***ing flame cannon? But when Aang wakes up, the real fight between Zuko and Aang begins. At the same time, back on the ship, Admiral Zhao tells Iroh that they've located the Moon Spirit, and that he intends to turn the Water Nation into his own personal fishing hole. This fight with Zuko and Aang feels really off, and I can't exactly explain why. Maybe it's the entire lack of bending from both of them, and the fact that Aang uses fully frontal attacks on Zuko. Isn't using attacks like this like the antithesis of airbending? Some of his attacks here are more about redirecting like they are in the show, but in the TV show, he pretty much never puts his hands on someone unless it's to confuse or distract them. Katara figures this fight scene has gone on for too long and freezes Zuko. And before leaving, Aang unfreezes his head and says, "We could be friends, you know?" They're trying and failing so badly to stay loyal to the source material. There was no reason for this to be here and not during the Blue Spirit scene. Iroh and Zhao find the Water Spirit. And this scene is pretty weird compared to how it was in the show. Firstly, the fact that they can't make fire themselves means that instead of the burning fist, he has to stab it super quickly. Are we even sure he actually stabbed the fish? Secondly, Admiral Zhao is annoyingly ambiguous on whether or not he wants to do this. In the show, he was a twisted man who did it without hesitation. Here, he's sweating like he's secretly a good person or something. Either way, both scenes end with Iroh getting royally pissed. The moon also turns red in the movie and not black and white like in the TV show. It's really hard to tell what's going on with the color grading and lighting though. All of these background fighters look indistinguishable. To me, they all look like Fire Nation. Iroh loses his shit, much like in the TV show, and it's supposed to be a big moment about him bending fire from nothing. But here it kind of just looks stupid. The CGI alone is pretty ugly, so that certainly doesn't help. Yue decides to give her life to the Moon Spirit, just as she does in the TV show. But what makes this scene so terrible is that in the show it's referenced that she has a connection to the Moon Spirit, where here she just kind of doesn't. And the scene isn't some dramatic goodbye like it is in the TV show, because this is what, like the 5th time we've seen her on the screen? And I think this is the 2nd time she's had input in a conversation. She was introduced 35 minutes ago, let her die, I don't give a f. Zuko and Iroh have their standoff against Zhao just as in the TV show, but instead of being killed by his own arrogance, inability to accept defeat, and a giant water spirit, he's defeated by 4 regular-ass unnamed waterbenders who suffocate him to death. Okay, you know what? Points for that one. That's hardcore. So yeah, the final fight ended up being as exciting as a root canal. There are so many things going on and none of it is interesting. There's so many battles and so much bending, but the fight is made boring because the movie is attempting to split the audience's attention between so many things that you don't care about. I don't care about Yue, I don't know her. I don't care about Aang, as far as I'm concerned he's just some kid. I don't care about Zuko, he's angsty and kind of a bitch. So every time that the movie decides to switch scenes, I'm just upset that the last one didn't wrap up already. Aang has flashbacks by becoming the Avatar and learns to accept that. He accepts that all of his best friends and teachers are dead because he abandoned them. Because that's what waterbending is all about. I'm not kidding, that's what the movie says. Waterbending is about acceptance and moving on. So he begins to cry and starts waterbending the whole ocean. He is literally tear-bending. He's literally tear-bending like the Katara actor from the Ember Island Players. Speaking of that, by the way, shout out to those guys for actually casting people of the correct race. You are less accurate than the filler episode. I will say, having the movie end with Aang being the one to bend all of this water all on his own is actually a pretty good move. I'm not a fan of huge kaiju fights, so I was never a huge fan of the end of book 1 and like every season finale of Korra, but I will say it's pretty annoying that the only reason he's able to do this is because he's finally going through the 7 stages of grief. Especially because it kind of contradicts what he'll need to do in order to unlock his 7th chakra, right? I also have no reason to believe that Aang is anywhere near capable of this at the time. Like, yeah, sure, Avatar state, but they never say the words Avatar state in the movie. This nigga just starts glowing and everyone's chill with it. After successfully fending off the Fire Nation, Aang goes down to accept his position as Avatar to all the grateful Water Tribe members, but he still looks so unsure. Wasn't that the whole point of what just happened? He should be accepting this with a smile. Instead, bro just looks like he's holding in the worst shit of his fucking life. Also, what is Katara crying for? Nothing happened. It feels like this is just what M. Night thinks that young girls are like. She's a young girl and therefore she needs to be crying when something happens. The movie ends with an Azula cameo, and I can't explain to you how damn happy I am that this movie never got a sequel. I don't like her casting, in all honesty. No hate to Summer Basil. She's a very beautiful young lady with a very gorgeous voice, and that's kind of what I don't like about her casting. Like, it's just one line, but I don't like how sweet she sounds. Gray DeLise did such a good job at making every single line from Azula sound so threatening, so overbearing. But this version sounds like she's gonna invite me to tea time and bake me a scone. Okay, now that we finished the movie, I think my first question for the creators of the movie is, what the did you spend $150 million on? Like, seriously, I was watching this movie and I couldn't figure out where the budget for this movie went. The cast at the time of filming this movie was pretty much a giant set of nobodies. Save maybe Jackson Rathbone, who was in Twilight 2 years prior. Even then, I can't imagine it would cost much more than an IHOP foot job to hire this guy. Even with the movie being heavy in the special effects department, it's not like the special effects are good. Speaking of which, bending actually looks like f***ing cat shit. Why did they make bending harder than just straight up punching people? Like, dead ass, in the time it took them to move that rock, we could have just kicked him in the nuts. Firebending can only be done with fire already present, even though creating heat through their body is something that they're stated to be able to do. But even then, the worst part of this is that this isn't Avatar. This is The Last Airbender. It's supposed to be a gritty take on the TV show, and that's fine, but if you're gonna do that, you still have to execute it, right? A large reason it doesn't even feel like this movie's in the same universe as the TV show is that none of these main characters retain their charm except maybe Sokka, and even then he's on thin ice. Aang is relegated to being some depressed middle schooler and they call that his arc. But realistically, that makes him a main character that we don't care about. In the TV show, Aang is upbeat and outgoing as a way to deflect from the fact that he carries guilt of the fact that his entire nation was wiped out in his absence. Also, I'm pretty sure in the show, he accepts the fact that it isn't his fault and he probably would have been killed too. But they say here that it is specifically his fault, even though he's just some kid who could only airbend. Avatar or not, that dude was gonna get kidnapped the minute the Fire Nation showed up. I don't think Aang smiles once in this whole movie. He's such a f***ing far cry from what made Aang such a good character in the TV show. And I've said this before, but Katara's personality is now just girl, which admittedly is kind of funny, but it's annoying that they took one of the best written characters in all of fiction and made her so unimportant and weak. It wouldn't surprise me if M. Night planned on killing her because he clearly had no interest in actually writing her. Can you imagine if this dude had to make a movie about Legend of Korra? Bro would find a way to make Mako the main character. Sokka is also reduced to atoms. I think in this movie he makes one joke. Outside of that, he's pretty much there to fill negative space. I don't think that they needed to give him his Kyoshi Warriors arc, but I do think that they needed to give him an arc. There is nothing about this guy that makes me give a singular shit about him. Sokka and Katara serve no purpose in this movie. I am completely serious when I say this, but if you left them in the Southern Water Tribe after waking up Aang, nothing would have changed. I don't even think I'm upset that they omitted so much stuff because I understand that this is a movie. You don't have time for everything, but you put yourself in the situation when you made the movie. Because you know what they could have done? They could have made the movie longer. 2 years ago, a 3-hour movie came out and made $2 billion. I don't know why they felt like they needed to make this movie under 2 hours. Because of this, Suki isn't here, Appa basically isn't here, and Katara doesn't have her hair loopies. Nothing is right in the world. And I'm also upset by this because all the things that were taken out weren't replaced by anything. My final complaint is the gross mishandling of Ozai. Once again, this dude is not threatening. I also don't think he needed to be in this movie at all. If you wanted him in the movie, he could have been an end credit tease. General Zhao should have been the main and only antagonist. Having Ozai here does nothing but overcomplicate the plot. Come to think of it, if you're not already a fan of Avatar and know everything that happens, does this plot even make any sense? I don't think it would. If I didn't have so much prior knowledge of anything that was going on, I'd feel like I just took way too much LSD. The writers did a pretty job in the coherency department. The only positive thing I have to say about this movie is that they got Iroh right. But he's nowhere near TV show Iroh, he's just not a dick. That and the air temple looks cool. Once again, it'd be hard to f it up though. So rounding it all out, I'm going to give this movie a 2 out of 10 on the critical score. The only 2 redeeming factors in the movie are the 2 things I literally just mentioned. Everything else makes me violently angry. For the fun score, we're gonna introduce something a little new. I'm gonna give this movie a -9 out of 10, meaning that this movie has no fun value if you're purely looking for a good movie. However, if you're looking for something to rip to shreds or watch ironically, I don't really know if there's a better use of 2 hours. Thank you guys so much for watching. This is probably the longest I've ever had a video be in production. I had to grab a lot of movie and TV show footage, and copyright sucks, so I made sure to take my sweet time to make sure nothing gets claimed or I can at least dispute it. Either way, if you're still here at the very end of this video, consider subscribing, and leave a suggestion for another video I can spend another 3 months on. And also consider checking out some of the other stuff I've made. I don't do a lot of super in-depth essay type videos like this one, but with more time and support on the channel, I'm hoping that will change. Until then, make sure you follow my Instagram for video updates, join the Discord to meet more like-minded people, and consider supporting the Patreon. But in the meantime, me and the gang are gonna go visit the zoo in the Earth Kingdom. And remember, there is no war in Ba Sing Se.